All right. And I believe we're live. Yes, we're live. And this is my first video of the new year, 2021. As I promised, I gave you the one, I think, for the pre-Christmas video and the one right after Christmas, or maybe it was just, hey, GW. Maybe it was just the Christmas one. I have trouble keeping track of my videos, which is funny because they're so frequent. My streams, I think it was over a week ago. So yeah, so I think this is the first one in of 2021. Yeah, Christmas Eve stream. So yeah, I posted one right before Christmas, and now we're in another year with the COVID vaccine that New York State is that Governor Meatball is denying to people who don't fit his criteria for inclusion. It's kind of, I don't know what people in the rest of the country think when they read stories about New York's government, the people in charge of administering the state. Like what are their perceptions when they see Andrew Cuomo on television with his bullet points? I'm always curious about that. Anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about the opening prayer delivered, if you could call it that, the invocation by Emmanuel Cleaver. This is a guy who's a congressman, I believe, from St. Louis. St. Louis, no, no, Kansas City. That's it. Okay, so the two majority minority districts in Missouri, I think, are Kansas City and St. Louis. So Cleaver represents Kansas City. He was actually a Methodist, or he is a Methodist pastor from the UMC, which is a which is a notoriously permissive liberal denomination. I think there are a couple of different Methodist divisions in the U.S., and the UMC is one of the main ones. So he's a pastor for them, and he has a doctorate of, or not a doctorate, he has a master's of divinity, which is probably, and he's a pretty liberal Democrat, which I suppose is why he was chosen to deliver this invocation to Congress. Although he was also one of the most vociferous Hillary Clinton supporters in the 2008 Democratic primary, to the point where, and you can actually look at this if you scroll down to the bottom of his Wikipedia article, where it discusses the 2008 Democratic primary. Hey, Jonathan, JP. He he got savaged by particularly black Democrats, for being, I think, one of the last holdouts when Hillary Clinton was still refusing to concede after Obama had mathematically pretty much wrapped up the Democratic nomination. I think he was one of the last holdouts, at least among African American politicians, to refuse. And there's even a quote from Jesse Jackson Jr., who I think was resigned his congressional seat in disgrace. I forget what happened there, but there's a quote from him saying, "If it comes down to the last day and you're the only super delegate, do you want to go down in history as the one to prevent a black man from winning the White House?" And Cleaver's response, according to this, was, "I told him I'd think about it." Um, yeah, so he supported her until she actually suspended her campaign. So uh, he's sort of a traditional uh, kind of corrupt big city Democrat, I guess you would describe him as. I think I forget if it was him or the St. Louis congressman, but one of them actually had a actually it might have been the one in St. Louis, because I think there was a black light a BLM primary challenger who defeated an incumbent congressman. So yeah, he's still in office. So it was probably the one in St. Louis who was challenged, but I think he also has had primary challengers in the past. Yeah, the it was strange. There was a handful. I think most of the black Democrats who supported Hillary were the ones, particularly the ones in positions of power. But there was also a lack of trust of Obama when he started his challenge, and I think this was a holdover from the suspicions, because he ran against Bobby Rush, who's a former Black Panther and a congressman from the South Side of Chicago, and the there was still animosity from that campaign. Black voters in that district, and I think this sentiment remained up until he actually won. He became a United States senator. There was a resentment against him as this sort of Hyde Park interloper, biracial, affluent. I think that's one of the reasons he married Michelle Robinson, because I think, in fact, I think one of Jesse Jackson's daughters was her bridesmaid, I believe, during her wedding. But she had these very strong roots in Chicago and ties to the traditional Democratic establishment. And she was also not she's not biracial, so marrying her sort of was an attempt to solidify these ties. But I think that was one of the reasons Black Democrats were suspicious of Obama, although obviously that changed. Yeah, I think the red and blue thing, I think that started in 2000. Prior to that, like if you go back and look at electoral maps from the 80s, you see the shaded portions were blue when they were won by Republicans. I think Republicans were represented. They sort of inverted the color scheme. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Tim. Um, but anyway, this is just a very long tangent. But getting back to the main subject. Hi, C. Um, Getting back to the main subject, this guy Cleaver was chosen to give the opening. I don't know if you would call it a prayer, but he gave the invocation for the new Congress. For obvious reasons, he was an African American pastor from this very liberal mainline Protestant denomination, and so there was nothing really surprising about that. But the actual words were so absurd that even people who would have overlooked something like this had to. And it was really funny. Someone, I forget who it was, someone on Twitter said, described him as the Babylon Bee pastor, the Babylon Bee pastor. And one of the writers for the Babylon Bee actually replied in the comments that this is something so stupid. This was something that he couldn't write. It's one of those instances where reality outpaces satire. So it was a great, it was a funny comment, but it was spot on. They focused on the woman thing, but as Matt Walsh pointed out, something even more bizarre, albeit maybe not as obviously stupid, was the fact that he praised Brahma. Somewhere in the remarks, he made a mention of Brahma, who's the creator deity in Hinduism and part of the Trimurti, this triad of gods responsible for creation and destruction and preservation. Brahma, according to Hinduism, is responsible for creation. I think Vishnu is responsible for preservation and Shiva's responsible for destruction. But he praised, and they all have a multitude of different avatars, and this is where you get all of these subsidiary gods like Ganesha and the fertility gods and all of these other sort of it's kind of akin to what you had in ancient Rome and Greece, where you would have one main god, one god that was the center, like Zeus, for example, and then you would have, or Jupiter, and then you would have all of these subsidiary gods like Athena, the goddess of defensive warfare, or Artemis, Demeter, and so forth. Kali, yeah, that's another one. These all, yeah, Brahmin are the main caste in India. They're kind of the opposite of the Dalits, who are at the bottom of the caste system. Late, yeah, I do. This does kind of look like a cowl when you when you look at the dim lighting. It looks like I'm in a robe with a cowl. It's kind of it is something you would see in the Star Wars film. Dalits or Helots? That's the question. But anyway, he praised Brahma in the middle of this ostensible prayer, and Matt Walsh was the one that, I think he was the one that brought this up, but I'm sure there were other people on Twitter that mentioned it. And I think I'm not sure. I know in Congress sometimes they'll have these non-denominational prayers, which would just be a generic prayer to God or the creator, but there won't be they won't explicitly mention who they're thanking or who they're invoking. But I can't recall anyone ever mentioning a Hindu deity in one of these prayers. I mean, if they were, it would be a Hindu priest, which, as far as I know, was never invited to deliver one of these prayers. I could be wrong about that. I think Tulsi Gabbard. I may be mistaken, but I think she's the only sitting member of Congress to be a Hindu. I could be wrong about that, but I think there were in the past. There have been Sikh members of Congress. I think there was a Sikh congressman from California way back in the 1960s. but this is the first time I've heard it, and there are a couple of odd things about this. One of them is the fact that it it sort of exposes the hollowness of this multicultural multicultural this attempt at placating multicultural sensitivities, because I'm sure Muslims were not pleased that Allah wasn't mentioned during the prayer, because all of they consider all religions subservient to Islam. And the fact that you have a large part of the Democratic Party that whose God was not mentioned at all, and yet you talk about Brahma, where I mean, even though most Hindus who are registered voters or Democrats, I'm sure they don't make up a significant voting bloc. Whereas in states like Michigan or Minnesota, Muslims, or uh, even places like New York, Illinois, there are significant Muslims are significant percentage of potential Democratic voters. So the fact that they weren't mentioned in this prayer gives you, I think it just serves to illustrate how vacuous this entire coexist philosophy is. Yeah, I actually think they're smaller than 6%. I mean, it depends on how you calculate. Of course, I mean there are uh but they do make it up a significant percentage in certain small, densely populated areas, like Minneapolis, for example. Parts of New York City, there are somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 Muslims. So, but my point is, they make up a much larger percentage of the Democratic electorate than Hindus, for example. Although, uh, and yet they weren't even mentioned, and I think that's one of the problems you have when you create this coalition, this electoral coalition built upon every every conceivable religious or ethnic division, and you try to hold it together with the promise of carving out a piece of the government for that particular group. It's sort of like the spoils system, only representational of ethnicities or or foreign religious factions. and you're trying to hold all of these mutually incompatible beliefs together with the promise of uh, of government favors. So, but on a broader philosophical basis, it's just impossible to cotton to every conceivable belief system when all of these belief systems are mutually incompatible. Um, New Millet system, maybe. Um, and there's actually a great channel called well, it's not. It's run by a pastor named Andy Rassman, and he was the one that invented this idea of contradict. So you've probably seen these coexist bumper stickers with, I think the O is the Taoist symbol, the yin and the yang, and the I forget what the I is. One of them is a crescent, which represents Islam. One of them represents Wicca, I believe. Hi, Inky. But basically, it's this idea that you can fuse all of these belief systems together. And Andy Rassman has this great, he sort of inverted this slogan, which is contradict, which shows how all of these things can't be reconciled. If you believe if you believe certain things about God, then you can't then that necessitates you disbelieving other things. So you can't just fuse all of these mutually contradictory ideas together. And he actually has a video describing this where he goes through this point by point, illustrating how you can't reconcile these antithetical beliefs. And I think that's something the Democratic Party is trying, even though the people behind it, I'm not sure they actually believe that these things can be reconciled, but they need to present that argument in order to sustain their coalition. That's true. Muslims and Hindus have always. But it's a really simple idea, but it's also something that you don't get a sense of when you watch when you when you're presented with a certain set of programming and you're conditioned by media, by newspapers, television, Hollywood, academia, to believe certain ideas, even if those ideas can't really be logically defended. I think sometimes you need to dissect them in a very simplistic way in order to get people to understand the flaws in this type of thinking. it's really, like I said, I think he's a pastor. Let me see. Yeah, he's yeah, so he has a BA in theological studies. There was someone that mentioned the fact that Cleaver had a master's of divinity, and there was a writer on Twitter who said he can't think of a more useless degree, which is probably accurate. But I think it's worse than useless. I think like you have a lot of I actually think of something like a master's of divinity is much worse than these seemingly worthless liberal arts degrees you hear conservatives. It's almost like a pat response when they ridicule someone who has a degree in gender studies or critical race theory. I don't know if that's um an actual major, but things like gender studies or Chicana studies, and I agree these aren't it's not a useful investment of your time or your money to pursue a degree in these type of things. But I actually think something like doctors, yeah, education degrees are the worst. Someone That's why the whole Joe. This is a bit of a tangent, but that's why the whole Joe Biden controversy was it struck me as so bizarre. The whole idea, even medical doctors, I don't have not to offend anyone, but I don't have a lot of respect for medical with someone who's an actual medical doctor. So the idea that I'm going to pretend that a degree in education or a doctor of education, this phony degree that Joe Biden has, because her husband is a U.S. senator. The idea that I'm going to pretend like a degree in education is an impressive accomplishment is it's just baffling to me. But yeah, I think something like a master's of divinity. And now I know people come back and say, well, John MacArthur has a master's of divinity, and they'll point to these godly, very um, kind of as a counterexample. They'll say, well, there are these pastors who've been used by God who have this degree, but I think in general, the kind of education you get from these seminaries is it's not only not worthwhile, but it's counterproductive. And I think Cleaver is sort of a prime example of this. It reminds me of in Second Timothy where Paul is warning Timothy, and he says that he's warning him about false teachers, and he says he he says having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. That's the type of thing you see with people like Emmanuel Cleaver and a lot of these graduates from accredited seminaries and places where you're supposed to be instructed into how to be a pastor. I don't think that's really scriptural, but it's also if you're looking at this and looking at what's being taught in 2021, a lot of these people are not even real Bible believing Christians. So the education you're going to get, it's not it's not wisdom. It's it's the theories and the ideology and the philosophy of the world, of the existing culture. And MD. Yeah, yeah, but my point is, I think in a lot of ways, something like that, like a master's of divinity, is actually worse than these meaningless liberal arts degrees um, that people, particularly women, spend thousands of dollars. They accrue thousands of dollars of debt in order to get degrees that have no practical utility, but also they don't have any. There's no real benefit to them, um, in terms of. I mean, psychologically, spiritually, there's nothing. There's nothing there, but the degrees that some of these pastors get are in some ways in many ways, I would say they're much worse because these are people who are ostensibly supposed to be shepherding their flocks, leading the church, and they're what does the Bible say? If a blind man, you know, the Pharisees were described as blind men leading the blind, and what happens? They both fall into a ditch, and that's pretty much what you see with a lot of churches. Um, hey, Terrence. Yeah. There's actually a good channel. I think I've mentioned this before. In fact, Alejandro, who I'm not sure if he's here, but he actually mentioned the fact that I brought this up on a couple of my videos. But there's a great podcast called Conversations That Matter by John Harris, and he does that's his primary uh, that's his primary field. He just covers all of these woke churches, particularly within Protestant denominations, and he comes at it from a Calvinist or Reformed perspective. But he doesn't spend much time on that aspect of his soteriology. He just examines why these false teachers, what's wrong with them biblically, and how they're leading the church astray. And I think that's one of the things you see with people like Cleaver. I mean, you see it in the black church, but also just the broader American church. You see the concerns that are preeminent are not are not biblical concerns. They're whether you're talking about social justice in the woke church, they're concerned with acquiring power, modifying the message, modifying the word of God in order to appeal to the world, or at least that's how they present themselves. Um, or another variant of this is the prosperity gospel. But I think the whole woke social justice, that's I think that is just another just weird variant of the prosperity gospel. Someone, in fact, that John Harris, who I just mentioned, he had he actually played some sound bites from Eric Mason, who's sort of the pope of the social justice woke church movement. He even wrote a book which is entitled Woke Church. And he played some clips from this guy, and there's really no way you could distinguish him from someone like Creflo Dollar, who wrote a book called The Holy Spirit, Your Financial Advisor. And at first I thought, when I saw that the cover of that book, I thought it was a mock-up that someone had. It turns out it's an actual book that he wrote. He wrote a book called, but see, the thing is, those are so transparently unbiblical and they're laughable. But the people like Mason and all of the racial hucksters in the woke church are I mean, their philosophy is just as insidious, but it has the imprimatur of respect because they're talking about racial injustice and uh, white fragility, and they're using all of this academic or pseudo academic jargon and buzzwords in order to appeal to um, to elite opinion. So you don't they're basically trying to mask the fact that what they're preaching is another gospel, and it is sort of like the prosperity gospel. Like these clips, when you listen to Eric Mason preach, he's no different than Creflo Dollar. It's just that instead of trying to siphon money directly into his pockets, he's trying to redistribute wealth in the form of payoffs to African Americans from Caucasians. So he's trying to use racial grievances um, and a pre-existing racial divisions within the country in order to pursue graft, basically, in order to enrich not just himself but enrich this whole priestly class of you know of of authors and pastors whose entire, like, the sum total of their gospel message, it's not about dying to self or the word of God or the sacrifice of Jesus for our sin. It's all basically just a repackaged version of 1960s era or pre 60s um you know racial Marxism, basically. And it's really no different than the prosperity scammers like Creflo Dollar or Joel Osteen. It just has this thanks to yeah. So like, I mean, that's what you see when you see when you when you see the woke church, and you see I guess I would consider Cleaver, but also like the quote unquote pastor, the supposed pastor who's running for the Senate in Georgia, this guy Warnke, who is the pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church. So he's the pastor at Martin Luther King Jr.'s Martin Luther King Sr.'s former church. And he's another guy. There's a radio interview where I think it's a Christian radio station. He was being interviewed, and he actually not only defends keeping abortion legal, but he actually exalts killing babies. I'm not exaggerating. You can go. I think John Harris, the 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 man I've been speaking about, he actually has a clip of this in one of his latest podcast episodes. He actually has a short clip of this, but he actually praises abortion, and he says you praising basically he basically says, and I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says that child sacrifice is a Christian. It's something that is part of Christianity, or I'm really I'm I'm stripping away the euphemism, but he's basically saying abortion is not only, you should not only condone it, but it's praiseworthy if you're a Christian. So I think calling them part of the church is a bit of it's kind of a misnomer when you get to people like this who are um who are literally praising child sacrifice. It's almost like saying that someone who worshiped Baal was equivalent to someone who worshiped Yahweh. And of course, when Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal, he said, why stand you between these two? Why it make up your mind. If Baal is God, then worship him. But if Yahweh is God, you have to make a decision. So there were people back then who tried to have it both ways, who worshiped Baal and tried to said that they were worshiping the Lord. And you can't have it both ways. You can't say you're worshiping God when you're denying him in this type of way. And the only reason someone like Warnke is using Christianity is not because he's a Christian, but because he realizes it's basically born of political expediency. The fact that he can use his pastorate, he can use the fact and exploit the fact that he is a pastor, so he can exploit the political power of the Black church in order to boost himself into office. Yeah, that's a good analogy. I actually read the Chronicles of Narnia for the first time a couple of years ago. I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was in elementary school in 5th grade, but for some reason I didn't read the rest of the books until adulthood. But yeah, he's basically using this as a means of acquiring power. That's the only reason. Same reason. Someone would present themselves as a feminist, or there's political cachet, especially in a state like Georgia, where you need the support of the Black community in order to succeed electorally. So there's a political cachet still attached to being part of the church, to being a pastor, even if the things you're espousing are even if they blatantly contradict what's in the Bible. If they contradict the word of God, you can still capitalize upon the fact that you're the head of you're the pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church. I thought they had made all of those into they actually did make I think all of the books into movies. The BBC did. The BBC had a great production of the Chronicles of Narnia years ago, I think in the early 90s. But I think they did the whole series. I was not impressed by the new movies. I think I've watched snippets from them. I was not a fan. My impression is they probably removed all of the or most of the Christian content and tried to turn it into some sort of Harry Potter-esque adventure fantasy series. I could be wrong. I haven't actually watched the films, but I've seen snippets from them, and I was not overly impressed. Oh, okay. So yeah. Oh, yeah. You're right. So they made 4. So I must have. Yeah, I watched those back when I was younger. So yeah, I guess they didn't make the rest of the. So that would be good if they could actually turn those into a regular series where they had a director, where it wasn't produced by Hollywood. That would actually be worth watching. That, and if they could make the Screwtape Letters into a movie, that would be cool. I don't know how you turn an epistolary novel into a film. I'm sure it's been done before, but there's a lot to work with. There was a writer, I forget what his name was, but there's this atheist English writer who wrote an entire series of fantasy novels in order to try to rebut C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. He basically, I mean, it shows you how adamantly atheists will try to deny the truth. This guy built his entire career. Pullman, yeah, that's his name, Pullman. Philip Pullman, I think. But yeah, he wrote an entire series of novels just because he was so angered by the gospel message contained in the Chronicles of Narnia. And they are not, I mean, they're popular. I think they're bestsellers, but I I seriously doubt that people will be reading these to their children, that they'll become that but who knows? I could be wrong. Ralph Bakshi, I think Bakshi did the Lord of the Rings. He did the animated version of the Lord of the Rings, I think back in the 70s. Bill Melendez. Yeah, he was the guy that did the Peanuts cartoons, the animated Peanuts cartoons for television. But yeah, before I got off on this rabbit trail, I think I was talking about the woke church. But yeah, Cleaver, I think that, just to wrap it up, I think that it just illustrates some of the things that are it kind of well, I think the main thing to take away from this is it illustrates the intellectual vacuity of coexist. The whole philosophy behind coexist is that everyone's all of these belief systems and all of these wildly divergent faiths and religions are reconcilable, which is not true. And you just need evidence of that. Just go to northern Nigeria or the Central African Republic and see what happens when you have one group that refuses to coexist, whose religion says that coexistence is not possible. Now, I think coexistence, the Bible urges coexistence in the sense of living peaceably with all men. In fact, Paul exhorts the followers of Jesus to live peaceably with all men as far as it's within your capacity to do so. So he said, you should be at peace with your neighbors, even if they believed in pagan gods and they worshiped idols, which was the case with most or almost all of the Christian communities that he was writing to. They were surrounded, particularly groups like the church at Corinth. They were within this very cosmopolitan area where they were exposed to all sorts of different false religions. So the idea of coexistence is actually contained in the Bible, but it's not the worldly concept of coexistence where false beliefs are interchangeable with true beliefs, where someone who is a man can call himself a woman, and then you're expected to entertain their delusions. That's not what That's not what. That's not. That's not a biblical form of coexistence. Eh, or the idea that Brahma is substitutable for the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that that Vishnu is replaceable with Jesus Christ. That's not what actual that's not what a biblical model of coexistence is. It's a worldly model which is not, it's not sustainable, and you'll see that increasingly as time goes by, particularly in places where this philosophy is being implemented. And you'll probably see it a lot over the coming year. Uh, you know, but yeah, yeah, the boss. That's, I mean, it's too late to go into it now, but yeah, the uh Tom. I would just recommend reading Tom Woods. He's a great writer with a lot of useful insights. Anyway, I'm gonna wrap it up before this hits an hour. Just want to thank everyone: Otto, GW, Tim, Inky, Lisa, Carolina, Metatron. Who else did I miss? JV, and anyone else who's lurking or watching. I appreciate it. Like I said, um, like I've said in past videos, if you like this, feel free to subscribe. If you're not subscribed already, I don't think that many people watching would not be subscribed, but I lose a lot of subscribers, so it's possible. But yeah, or share if you want to share a an hour long video of me meandering on various topics. Uh, but that's your choice. Anyway, I will see you all soon, hopefully sooner than, a couple of weeks. But thanks, everyone, and have a good night.